I need some notes last night. I welcome everybody. So interested in that. What's that? Something blowing up. I already got the wrong guy.
I think you're gonna be good to go. Yeah, we're in class together. Alright. Yeah. Oh, we're in class, so. Yeah, I didn't know if anyone's favorite. Yeah, yeah. How did it come on? I got to which class you're in.
It was cognition.
Or, American.
Are we?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like it's a room. Yeah, I was working on a computer thing yesterday.
Yeah.
For budgeting.
Are you guys, are you using actors?
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to use something different at this point. I don't know. I'm not trying to use it for my
Yeah. Been, having some issues, like,
actually.
yeah, actors cool. And we had a phone, like, template that we would use for the app. But now that we figured out how to actually test on mobile devices, we took it home, played it out, and we got to resize everything.
Yeah.
And it's not really that cool with that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but I didn't consider actually testing it on mobile. Yeah. So that's resizing it.
Well,
Yeah. So I think mine, which is like
Yes.
quad HD display, like really weird.
okay, give me 1 second, I'm doing I just sent your email. Let me do something else. And then YouTube channel you can actually go to.
It's like everything that
All right, I'll send you a second. Yep.
Yeah, you know, someone needs it. I have a little bit of difficulty integrating my teammates. Just trying to get it done at this point. Yeah.
You guys been doing like hangout videos?
Yeah, we usually use Oh, yeah, my. And it's already. It's almost done. The last.
Oh,
That part's easy. Yeah. I did that. I did this with him. I had my question. I don't know. Change it.
yeah.
That's one thing that I don't think it's the best. Greg had like issues finding a button, so we had to like replace that button on every screen. And just doing that and the race side and all that. Yeah. I used the other program. I just use it's really but
Hey, yeah.
it's really limited. So you can try it out. It's like I think it's free. And you'll just see the template, even like the all like you'll see it covering over the boosted or
I see that.
it covers that basically like Hey.
Yeah, you were in the group that was in the lab there, like 2 semesters ago, downstairs. I think you were testing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, good.
We're good.
Good. Got a new lab now, so
Any more chips? The whole front row. There's donuts and whatnot over there. Ooh, someone else is watching.
Someone's on the channel?
Yeah.
It sure is.
Yeah. I ate my breakfast already.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm not gonna eat it.
Damn.
Good. I want to eat it now. You?
Camera.
Sure.
We're broadcasting from this camera right here, so we can see the board. So all the audio and video is coming from right here. So yeah, the video.
They like looked over my resume and they like showed what I need to like fill out and stuff like that. But they require like 2 pages or whatever, so they're like flooded. So
They told you.
yeah.
They told you. I see the government already.
Yeah.
The government wants you to lie.
It's like a watermark.
Do the remote folks have audio in, or they're just listening?
In the government.
Yeah,
The
maybe.
viewers on the YouTube channel, no, they're just seeing the live stream. The people who are in the group chat can type messages, but
Okay.
if we turn on their video, it'll be all over the recording, which I don't think works well.
That's fine. I'm just curious.
Every single, it was like 40.
So is someone going to monitor the texts or if they have questions?
This semester, it's
Probably.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is like all the
Corroborate.
Yeah, I'm gonna go that way.
So it might be able to-
Real like the classes. And then the next semester.
Yeah. Especially
Oh, that's
programming,
fine. I
if
wish
it's passed over like a week for
that,
2
I
weeks,
didn't know.
it might be better.
That I was gonna do that.
I think that's the
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah, no, this is like.
I'd rather do
graduating.
No, I,
Yeah,
I
the other one, the curriculum that we offer is like,
I have no idea. Everyone is
Like,
looking at it all.
like, it's a lot of recognition.
I have no
I'm gonna start the thesis and next spring, and apparently I don't know.
How do you do a whole lot? I think that was maybe the right answer with you. I'll take that. Yeah, but you kind of just want to like where you have. Because I think you would have taken jobs with people, so maybe.
I mean, the thing is, the background is like,
Yeah.
Is it still the same location?
No, that's the
Oh, is it still? Oh, cool.
So I actually got
that bridge is like really stepping through it.
I'm looking for actually.
Like, you spend a lot of time in
In the area or you could yeah.
I will,
I live in Hartford County, so it's not very
I
Um,
think it'd be good to just knock out.
Yes, we go online. For those who are online, we're gonna get started in a few moments. I'm talking that computer, but yeah.
Oh, wow.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah. So maybe, or another system for that. Already locked into a job. Rushing in any way, shape, or form.
That's only locked in here.
Did you get that through,
the same program she did? I didn't. So like it's made from recycled.
Yeah,
It is.
it seems like it. It's from a design conference that my sister went to.
So that's
That's why it's like,
Oh.
Yeah. So like one side,
Yeah.
it's just like a blank.
Oh.
And then you flip it
We
over.
have,
Yeah.
two classes.
Actually,
And a new prototype.
I'm not used to it.
A little too fancy for me.
That was a paper product.
Yeah, yeah.
We did a paper product.
I don't know.
I hope so.
Yeah, this one.
Okay.
Here, actually. Way Ranger.
Yeah. I'm feeling happy, but
No.
So that's what I was thinking, yeah.
Yeah.
are we excited? That's good. People are kind of like Justin Ben and for the people who are coming, but whatever. Okay, go on. All right, thanks everybody for coming. I know pretty much all of you here. Hopefully this is like the first of a recurring thing for this group. Don't roll your eyes at me. So I'm turning over to Kevin Scott. He's going to talk about kind of like how to do UX in the real world. So there's a lot of stuff that we learn in the program, but there's a whole component that we don't really touch on, and kind of like the business of doing UX. I think we're really interested in that. So turn over to Kevin.
Hey, everyone, can we cut down like the mic?
Alright, you can turn that one off. That was just a test.
You just need to log out of here. All right.
Just exit, it's fine.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Great to see everybody up so early on a Saturday morning for something they don't have to do. So that's awesome. As Andrew said, my name is Kevin Scott. I'm a graduate of the IDEA program, also a graduate of the corporate communications program at UB. So I'm a UB all the way through. You guys are in a great program. If you want to do anything in the software development world or web world, the foundations that you get here, if you work at it, should serve you very well. And as I learned in the IDEI program and the corporate communications program, the most important thing is audience. So the first thing I want to do is I want to hear from you all, and what you do, where you come from. I know most folks are not necessarily full-time students at UB, probably have had worked, even if you're lucky enough to just do school at this time. So I just want to go around and kind of get an understanding of your background, so I can kind of make sure I'm speaking to you in the right way. So I'll start here.
I'm Brian. Nice to meet you. I was a graphic designer for many years, and then I started the graduate program, and then I recently took a job as UX manager for Care First Health Insurance Company.
Okay, very good.
Alden, I'm also in the grad program, obviously, and I would come from an arts background, and then film and video. I'm kind of making a horizontal transition.
Okay.
Andrew, so I did IT consulting for Accenture for about 7 years, and now for the past year or so, I've been doing UX work for Northrop Grumman.
Okay. Very good. You Medicare, Medicaid? Or?
No, it's supporting Social Security Administration.
Okay.
So kind of, it's not like
You see those jobs all the time. SharePoint? You touch any of that?
No, not really, just SharePoint.
I saw he was eating, so I thought I'd get him.
Yeah, I'm Zach. I'm also in IDEA in the master's program. My background was basically academia, and I work as a graduate assistant for Greg Walsh, doing research. So research.
Okay.
I'm Dave Bird. I work as a researcher, writer, analyst for the Air Force, and I'm in the DS program.
I'm Emma. I went to school for graphic design, and then I kind of trying to make a shift, so I'm doing the certificate program right now, the user experience.
I'm Jessica. I went to school for art, creative technology, and I teach computer science to kids in Baltimore City. The school in East Baltimore, and I'm in the IDEA program.
I'm Stacy. I have a business background, business HR, and I do have time work with my employer in Baltimore, then also have an internship in DC as an internet developer, which means I just do visual design stuff.
Okay.
I'm in the IDI.
I'm Joel. Was UB all the way through, so I did STE and then transferred over to here. Working in the user research lab, and I'm also a part of the IDIA program.
Okay.
I'm Julian. I have a background in business and computer information systems, and now I'm a SharePoint web developer as an Army contractor.
All over the place, lots of arts people, probably love doing those user interface design work. So, give you my background. As I said, I was a corporate communications major, and after school I went and I worked for the Department of the Environment, and I did public participation, basically running meetings for air and radiation administration work. And then UB offered their first HTML class, and I didn't sit in the first class, but I jumped into the second class. This is back when the web was kind of a thing that you heard about, but nobody knew anything about. So I took that HTML class and I got involved in that and learned that, and just levied that into working for Harford County, Harford Community College. It was their first webmaster, so I built their first website. And during that process, they were like handing me these text files and saying, here, code these up in HTML. And I was like, well, we have a database back there. Why don't we just interface with the database and let it build this HTML? And they were like, no, somebody will do that for us. Some corporation or something will do that for us. And I was like, all right, didn't have time for that. So got an Access database, got the tables, started doing ASP.NET and Notepad back in the day, and started teaching myself programming. I should say I did some programming in high school, so it wasn't a completely foreign concept. And so I did that for a number of years, and then IDIA program came along, and I thought, wow, that looks pretty cool. So I jumped into that. I started doing that. Just so none of you get discouraged, it took me 7 years, taking a class at a time to get through the whole IDIA program. You know, it's a long time, but you know, about that 5th or 6th year, you start looking at it and you're like, wow, I'm almost there. And you know, that last couple of years just really flies through. The whole time I was doing the IDIA program, I was taking the principles I was learning in class and I was applying it to the things I was doing in school or doing in the workplace. And at the time I worked for the community college as a webmaster, so I was doing a lot of what they talk about in the IDIA program about creating web pages for customers or for users and really thinking about the interaction with them. And after a while at that job at Harford Community College, I kind of reached a point where there wasn't anything more for me to learn there. I was kind of doing everything, and there wasn't anybody above me that was going to teach me anything. And I was trying to do programming, but there really wasn't anybody that could be like, well, you know, this is a good way to do programming. So I started looking around, and I found another contracting job with a company that did .NET development. And they happened to be starting up something called SharePoint, which is a Microsoft Portal product. Anybody familiar with SharePoint? Okay, a little bit of familiarity. It's an online platform for collaboration or for document storage. If you want a guaranteed job in the future, get into SharePoint because it's everywhere. It's growing. I get 5 to 6 emails a day. Hey, I need a developer. Hey, I need an administrator. I mean, there's just jobs everywhere. And wherever you want to go work, West Coast, Northwest, South, wherever, there are just jobs everywhere. And the Army and government are big into it. So anyway, I got a job in that development shop, and I started learning development. I was still in the IDIA program, so I was taking the concepts I was learning from class, and I was putting them into place in the projects I was working on, and finding that it served me very well. And from there, I went and I worked Harford County Public Schools as a developer, and then I took a job with the Army contracting again, and as a SharePoint developer, and started doing development, and eventually built a development shop. I was lucky enough to have Julian join the team, and we worked for about 3 years, and just recently left that to take on another development shop because it let me work from home 100%. So I thought, let me give that a try. It sounded pretty good. So I just started that last week and getting used to that. So that's kind of my work history and things. So let me talk a little bit about software development and what the different methods that are out there that I've encountered in my work. The first thing I want to touch on is called CMMI. Anybody heard of CMMI? Okay. So Carnegie Mellon, back in the 70s, came up with CMMI. Grab my notes so I get this right. I believe Capability Maturity Model Integration, CMMI. And it's scaled from 1 to 5 different levels of CMMI. So Carnegie Mellon says, okay, the first level is a development shop where you have heroes. Essentially, you have a software developer, or 2 or 3 maybe, who just, they're good, they have a lot of integrity, they're willing to just get the job done no matter what, they'll stay on the weekend, they'll just do it. So you don't necessarily have any processes in place. You just have people that are good, and you rely on those people. So the advantages of that are, well, it's kind of cheap because you just have to pay the person, you don't have a lot of overhead, and I'll talk about the overhead when we get into some of the other levels. But there's a lot of risks involved because you're relying on an individual, and if that individual says, well, I think I want to go work at home for a while, I'm out of here, then you don't have any way to recover, especially if you have something going on, like he takes all of that knowledge with him. So that's level 1. It's the lowest level in it, and quite frankly, there's a lot of shops that are at that level 1. They just kind of rely on the people they have. So then you go to level 2, where you have some processes in place. So if somebody comes in, they can read the processes and go, okay, when we deploy, this is what we did go through. It's, you've got formal documentation, but it's not real rigid. Level 3, you have all of your processes in place, so somebody can step in, they can read through the processes, they can much less reliant on any one individual to do everything, to know everything. It's all documented, it's all written down. Level 4, you take that and you step in another step forward where you actually have all those processes in place, they're written down, and you're doing reviews on them to see, this is actually working. And then level 5, you're seeing that they're working, you're doing reviews, and you're doing continuous improvement on those processes. So 5 sounds great, but there are disadvantages. It's very expensive. Whereas in level 1 shop, you could have 2 or 3 people doing software development, rapidly doing things, change things, very dynamic. Manager comes in one day and says, hey, your customer says, I want to do this today. You're like, okay, and you just switch and you just go and do it. So you can be very responsive to your users or to your audience. CMMI level 5, with all of that rigidity in place, you can't step over here without sending a report or sending a request in. Can I step over there? Yeah, okay, you can step over there. And so it becomes very rigid and very inflexible and very expensive because you have a lot of people who you need to have in place to process all of that paperwork, to process all of those requests. And I'm not really saying any one is better than the other. It really kind of just depends. If you're building weapons or you're building something that's, you've got to have everything right every time, you want to have all of those things in place so that if this guy leaves, we can stay on schedule. Level 5 projects tend to get done on schedule, but that schedule is going to be pushed out much longer because there's so much going on to be able to do something. Level 1 is very high risk. You may not get things done in time, but you can get small things done very quickly and very responsibly. Okay? So that's sort of when you go out into the world and you're working in software shops, at some point or another, people will refer to CMMI. When you're bidding on contracts, a lot of times contracts will have requirements. This shop has to be a CMMI level 3 shop in order to bid on this contract. So it's something you need to be aware of, something you need to think about, be a little bit familiar with, go out and research a little bit more. It's kind of a dry topic, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it. So within the CMMI levels, you have different approaches to software development. And when I started doing it, it was Waterfall was the method that everybody was interested in. And Waterfall says, all right, we're going to go get requirements. Once we have those requirements, we're going to analyze them, and we're going to start developing a plan. And it's a very, very step-by-step process. Make sure I wrote some of these down so I can skip through. So conception, initiation, analysis, design, construction, testing, production implementation, and maintenance. It's all the things you would think would take place during software development. And the thing about Waterfall is that once you finish a phase, you move on to the next phase. And it's thought of as, when this phase is done, we move to the next phase, we move to the next phase, move to the next. It's very linear. There's not necessarily a lot of flexibility involved in that process. So if there's changes that come along, they may not get incorporated because, well, we already did the analysis, we already decided what we're doing, we're just building. And what you find in the waterfall a lot of times is by the time you get done and you put a product in front of a customer, the customer is like, well, that really isn't what I had in mind. And there is just a whole lot of software projects that end up in that boat. So it's very important throughout the process that if you're using the waterfall method, that you do get customer feedback. And that's where some of the techniques and tools that I learned when I was in the IDEA program have helped me. And I have here on the board, this was developed, this is an application that we developed, web-based application for doing performance reviews. And it's all based, it's .NET based, but really that doesn't matter so much. But what I like to do is, after I meet with the customers and I talk to them and I start getting the requirements and I start documenting text, I start building out. And I call the first, this is actually a little bit along the way. Anybody done sitemaps? Good, talk to the right group. So the first thing I do when I talk to somebody about a project is I start jotting down, and I usually 11 by 17 paper and pencil. I mean, it's just so much faster than, I'm gonna drag this box and make this little widget here. Get that paper and pencil out, and I start drawing boxes, and I start mapping out what an application is gonna look like. What are the screens that a user is gonna interface with, from the top, from the home, and then all of the other pages that are gonna be required. And the first stab at it is really just gonna have the home block. I've got a manage evaluations block. I've got view evaluation report. It's really just going to be those big chunks. I'm really just trying to get an idea of the scope of the application I'm going to build and what it's going to require. Because the first thing, of course, they're going to be is like, well, how long is this going to take? And that's really hard in Waterfall because you're right at the beginning. You're thinking about it. You know about this much of what the customer has in mind. They've got this grandiose idea. And they're sharing about this much, but you're only really hearing about this much. So, but they're going to be like, well, how long is it going to take? And, well, I can do that in 3 weeks, because that's what it seems like when you're talking to them. It seems like, oh, yeah, that's going to be easy. They just want a few pages. They want to be able to input some information and then output the information. Cool. So I start jotting that out. And then I go back to them with that sitemap, and I sit down with them. And I talk about, the process. Okay, well, you're going to have this home screen, and who are the people that are going to interact with this application? And at that point, you're going to find out that you only have a half or a third of many boxes on the screen as you need. That's a great way to kind of ferret out those requirements from that user that you're talking to about this app is, who is going to use this application? Because when they start talking about all the people that are going to interact with it, you start thinking about, okay, well, what are the pages I'm going to need to support those people? And they're all going to be different. You've got the users coming in this instance to respond to their evaluation or to fill out the pre-evaluation. You've got the manager who's going to get it. You've got the HR person who's going to be receiving them and then putting those all together. And you've got the HR person who needs to create the evaluation, put the questions in. You want it to be dynamic. You don't want it to be coded with questions. You want them to be able to put the questions in. So as you talk to the users, or who the users are, you start to get a sense of what the scope of the application is going to be, and you start filling out more boxes and more boxes. Now, if you're a developer, the first thing you want to do from that point, you just want to sit down and start writing code. And it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And the reason is because when you start coding, you get down to this point, you haven't thought about it, you have to stop coding. You have to go back to the people who are asking for it, and yet say, well, what do you want to happen at this point? And a developer has to be on a roll. Does anybody do any development? Okay, so am I right, guys? I mean, you get in a groove, right? You know what you need to do, you get in a groove, and you can fly through it. You hit a point, you don't know what's going on, what happens?
You sort of lose focus, and you don't know. Yeah.
And how long does it take to get back to that point you were cruising?
Start spinning again.
You're like hours sometimes before you kind of get back into the groove, all the variables I'm keeping track of.
Yeah, you sort of lose your like mental concept of what you're supposed to be designing. That's like when you have to like reset and rethink about what it is you're making. Like you said, it just takes forever to like get in that mindset again, and sort of be able to conceptualize what you're making.
You're right on with the way I've experienced it. A developer has the application in their head while they're working it. They've got all these connections and all these paths. It's kind of like you get it in your head how this thing's going to work. And you're coding, and you're like, okay. And as soon as you hit a point where there's some question about which direction it should take, it kind of like all blows up, and you have to think about where you're going to go. You know, you shift gears, and then to get all that kind of loaded back in takes a long time. So you want to avoid that. When I've developed and had the best time, it's because I had all these details worked out before I even started coding. And I just pulled that page in front of me and I said, okay, this is what it's got to do. This is how it's going to interface. So wireframes. Done wireframes? All right. This is sort of a combination of the sitemap, which is the initial thing I start with. It's very generic, doesn't have a lot of details, and then the wireframes. So this didn't start out as one big sitemap wireframe diagram. Each page was its own panel. I use Visio because that's what I like. It was just one page in Visio. All right, I need to build the manage evaluation assignments page. So in Visio, I go through that page and I design it all. And Visio is very forgiving. It's not like code. If I was trying to build this page in code and then go back to the customer and say, is this what you wanted? And he says, no, that's not really it. And I had to go back and then recode that again. That would take a lot of time. I do it in Visio and he says, no, that's not what I had in mind. It's okay, delete that. And it doesn't take much time at all. So you want to, if you're going to be designing an application, you want to find a way to do it that's low cost up front. Because the best thing you can do is put this stuff in front of your customers. Customers, they don't want to spend any time at all thinking about this application during the development process. You've got to drag them into the room. You've got to sit them down. Paper prototypes, you guys done paper prototyping? It works. You make people think about what's going to happen, and they don't want to think about it. They work in HR. They don't know anything about the software development process. They told you what they want. They told you what they want. You heard what they want. There's a big divide between that, and the only way to bridge that gap is to make them interact with what you've heard. You sort of draw it out of them. I don't always put it all in one page like this. Sometimes I will take these individual pages in a room like this, and I will tape all of those pages up on the wall. And I'll bring them into the room, and I'll say, okay, we're going to create a new review. So we go to the pages, so we're going to click new review, and we will walk the application all the way through. It sounds like a lot of work, but it saves so much time in those really time-intensive activities, programming, if you can work that all out. Because even if that little button that you see doesn't seem very important, for the developer, he has to know when that button is clicked, what dialogue is going to come up, what are the options on it, what happens when I click save. He has to know every single detail all the way through. And if you leave them out, if you're the designer of the app and you just hand it off to the developer and you leave out those things, you're basically saying, do what you want. And you may not be happy with the result. It's most likely not going to be what you thought it was going to be, because excuse me, a developer who's not gone through this process, who's not gotten focused on user-centered design, is focused on computers and doing cool things. Programmers, developers love to do cool things. And it doesn't matter if it really fits what the user needs. If it's cool, it's going to drag him towards it, and he's going to probably go that direction. And you are in for quite the challenge when you get done, and he built this really cool thing, and you tell him that doesn't fit in the application because he's vested in it. He's not going to want to leave it, is he? He's going to want to hold on to that and find a way to work that in, because he invested 3 days making this really cool thing. Developers are like that. You know, we get attached to things that we do. So you want to make sure up front you've defined it so that when he develops, he's developing things you want, he can make the things you want cool. Does that make sense? I mean, developers are people. They're just little, they're creative, but they're technical at the same time. So you have to deal with that. I'm sure you designers, you guys must be the same way. You know, somebody comes and says, I want you to design this thing, and you put that time in and you love this thing you've designed. And if they tell you it's not what you want, what they want, you're hurt. You want to find a way.
They're hurt and they're stupid.
Yeah. So it's the same sort of thing with development, just in code. Okay. So once I've got the site map, I create those wireframes, and then I try to put it all together, and I connect all the pieces. It's hard. I had a manager one time who told me, just start coding, just get going. Come on, you got to get this done. And if I followed his advice, I never get done as quickly as I get done when I follow this approach. Because when you just start coding, you code yourself into corners, and then you find yourself someplace where you have to figure out how to get out of it. Or even worse, sometimes what will happen is that you'll kind of code yourself around something back in here and there, and then get where you need to be. But that code in between is not something that's supportable. It's not something that works particularly well. It tends to be buggy. So having a good picture and being able to code right to the final product is much more useful. So we started this. Excuse me. We started this conversation talking about Waterfall, or the Waterfall development method. And in that method, you're kind of moving through the stages, thinking about the whole thing and doing it along the way until you get to a final product in the end. And it works if you're sensitive and you interact with the customers a lot during the design process. You can really get a good sense of what they need. You walk them through user testing on the paper prototypes. You really you can get to a point where you understand what they need and you can build it out. Several years ago, Agile came along. So the Agile development process is much more iterative. It's focused on building something quickly and getting it done and getting it polished and putting it out there on each release cycle. So if I were building this using an Agile process, I wouldn't think about the whole application. I would think about just maybe the homepage for that first release. And I would come up with what I need to do to make that first piece finished. And I would build that, I would test that, I would publish that out and test, I would have users testing it. When they get that testing it, I would push it to production, and I would have something for the customers to interact with right away, as soon as possible. And then we meet with the customers and we get the next set of requirements. So that's kind of a very general way of talking about it. Let me go into some of the mechanics of the Agile process. So it's nice to have a tool when you're doing Agile to keep track of everything. And Microsoft Team Foundation Server, I know some people are not Microsoft people, but this product works really well. As an architect leading a group of developers, it wasn't until I used Team Foundation Server that I ever felt like I knew what everybody was doing and that they were heading to where they needed to head. But Team Foundation Server provides you with the tools that if you're leading an effort, it provides you with the tools to keep track of those things. So what do you do? In Agile and Team Foundation Server, you create user stories. So have you done user stories, right? So you create these user stories and you put them in your what's called the product backlog. Just a long list of all of those user stories that you need. And ideally, you meet with the customers and you say, what are the most important things for you, for us to work on, for you to get done? And you prioritize that list, that backlog item, those user stories. And the Scrum Master, the person that's in charge of this backlog, is working on identifying level of effort on each of these user stories. So you get a sense of, all right, well, how long is it going to take to do each one of these user stories? And in a very general way, not, it's going to take 6 hours. It's more like, well, that'll take a half a day. That'll take at least a day. That'll take 1 or 2 days. That'll take 3 to 5 days, 5 to 7. At that point, you don't want to get bogged down in it's going to take this much time. You really want it to be very general because you're just trying to get a sense of how long an effort is going to be. Once you have that product backlog item, those product backlogs, and you meet with a customer and you get their priority of what's important for them to get this piece done, then you meet with the developers and you say, okay, these are the things, and you, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So you work in Agile for a fixed period. And it can be 2 weeks or it can be 3 weeks, could be longer, it depends on the team and how it works. We experimented with 3 weeks and 2 weeks, and we ended up at two week development period. So you have a group of developers that can work in 2 week period and they can get a certain amount of work done, right? You could work them to death and you could get more work done, but the next week, the following week, you might not get that much out of them because they're going to be burned out. And the beautiful thing about Scrum, or about Agile, is that it was developed by developers for developers, in my mind, because managers are always saying, here's the project, get this done, I want it in 2 weeks. And they have no idea what it's going to take to do it. So by creating those user stories, assigning values to it, you start to get a sense of how much work is going to be required. And you can say, well, I've got this development team, and there's a term called velocity. And what velocity is, it's the amount of work that team can get done within that 2 week, what they call a sprint period. So if your sprint is 2 weeks, you know after a while how much your team can get done in that 2 week period. Now, that's not how much they can get done if they went balls to the wall. It's how much can they get done in a reasonable time, because you don't want to burn out your developers. You don't want them, wiped out. You want them to be fresh every week to come in and to do that velocity, whatever that number is. So you take that velocity, let's say it's 15, and you look at your user stories in your product backlog and say, okay, well, that's 3, and that's 2, and that's 5, and that's 1, and that's 4, that's 15. And you cut it off right there and you say, okay, these are the items we're going to work on during this 2 week sprint. Right? You know the team can do 15. You pick 15 off and you put it in the sprint, and that's what they work on for that 2 week period. And that's sort of in my mind, that's the beauty of Agile development from the developer's perspective. The expectations on what you can get done are correct. we know this team can do this amount of work. This is the amount of work that we have to get done. So when that manager says, you got to get this done, you say, well, I'll be happy to get done what we can. You tell me what's the most important thing on this list, and we'll move that to the top, and we'll put that in the sprint. So the concept is in Agile that you're always working on the thing that is most important to your customers. So when, go ahead.
So now is something like that going to work in an R&D setting where you're not sure how long something's going to take to do, you know?
The idea when you've got those user stories is that you want to break them down so that you do get a sense of, you don't want a user story that's 15 days. You want to break if it's 15 days, then you need to look at that user story and break it down a little bit more. So in an R&D development, I mean, you're right, there are some unknowns in there. Like, we don't know how long that's going to take. And it's flexible. I mean, we're all humans. We understand things are going to take longer sometimes. But what you want to do is you want to break that unknown down to at least give yourself, well, we think that's 3 to 5 days. And maybe the first sprint, what you're really trying to do is identify a plausible path forward. And we're going to give that a 3, which could be, 4 to 6 days. And it's, you want to try to put it, you want to try to put something to it and put some constraints around what you're doing. Because, I mean, in an R&D environment, yeah, you could just send somebody out to figure something out, and if they don't feel any kind of timeline, they might just wander around for much longer. But if they're feeling, I don't know about you, but if I have a constraint on a time or something, I am much more focused on a result and getting something than if somebody says, well, go spend a couple weeks and see what you can figure out. Okay, yeah, I like this kind of open-ended things. But it's not necessarily, it's not that I couldn't get that done in a week if I were more focused on something. So you want to make sure the user stories are focused enough that you can give it some sort of time constraint. Because you don't want it to be completely open-ended.
So you said you know how much the team can get done. I'm sure that has to be quantified in some way as well. So we're placing story points per story, right? Which is like an estimate of time.
Okay.
There has to be some type of feedback loop of hours actually logged for development against those stories to see if those point estimates were correct, and if not, they need to be adjusted over time, right? And I think that doesn't very often happen, at least in my experience. I think it's always, oh, that's 3 points, and then it turns out that wasn't the case, but 3 points remains 3 points, So,
I had the benefit of standing up an Agile group, working with Julian and the rest of the team. And we had nothing to go on. We had nothing. We're having Scrum meetings. And the Scrum meeting is a daily stand-up where everybody in the group goes around and you have any problems? You good? What are you working on? All right, that's it. You don't spend tons of time talking about the application. What are you working on right now? Do you have any barriers in the way? No? Okay, go. So that's a morning meeting, stand-up. It's called Scrum meeting. So we started out, let's hold Scrum meetings. We didn't have TFS, we didn't have user stories. We just started trying to work towards Agile, recognizing it was going to be imperfect for a while. And it took us 6 sprint cycles before we started to understand the velocity. And that was just only on one project did we get that sense of what the velocity of the team was. I guess you have to have a Scrum Master who's sensitive to what's going on. Now, we did those estimates for the user stories, and I said those are very generic, just trying to get a sense. But once the work is assigned for a sprint period, the developers then go into each one of those user stories and create tasks that they're going to perform to get that user story done. And those tasks become their daily work items. Those are the things that we reported on when we're in our Scrum meeting. I'm working on this task on this user story. And those tasks get a much more concrete estimate of effort. because the developer at that point, it's not some big thing, this user story that, I'm going to create an interface that lets the user save the application. It's going to code the button to save the text on the screen. It's a very discrete thing, so the developer should be able to put a quality time estimate on that. And those time estimates, when you get done, feed into that total elapsed time, how long it takes, and then feeds into your velocity calculation. And is your velocity, are they like, that's fixed, that's what it is, it's always what it is?
I think the trouble we have, as I understand it, is developers accurately logging their time worked. It's like the last thing that everybody thinks about, so. But it's kind of the most important when you're trying to gauge.
Yes, you're trying to figure it out. And what I try to impart to developers is, this is going to help you. That's right. Because if you're not logging your time accurately, then somebody's going to say, well, you can do a lot of stuff in this sprint. So Agile is for developers. It's so developers can do the work and not have to be not have more work put on them than they can do, not less than they can do. It's sort of to right line the amount of work that you can expect a developer to get done. And the other benefit is when I had customers come to me and say, well, how long is this going to take to do? It became a lot easier to put a good time frame on things, because I started thinking about things in terms of sprints. How many sprints is this going to take to get this amount of work done? And it's much easier to estimate than to say, well, how long is that going to take for you to code? 3 months. And that, right out of the hip pocket and right to the customer. That's what happens in Waterfall. You don't know. But when you can say to a customer in an Agile development environment, well, in 2 weeks, I'm going to have this page available for you. They feel like they're getting something. And I learned long ago in doing this work that it's all about customer expectations. Everybody always talks about the bottom line and getting it done. But I found that people want to know what's going on, and if you provide the expectations and you deliver on those expectations, you can keep a happy customer. If they've got unrealistic expectations, the Agile process will flush that out. Because if they've got 50 user stories that are 600 points and they're asking you to do that in a number of 200, the number of sprints for 200 points, it's pretty easy to point to that and go, well, you want me to do all this. This is how long it's going to take to do these things. This is how much my team can do. You can give me more team, so I have a velocity that will meet your expectations, or we can extend the timeline. It's all of a sudden you started to quantify it a little bit, and you've got leverage. In this, I never felt like I had any leverage with people when they said, I want this done on this date. I'm like, okay, I'll try. All right, or you just said okay, right? You just say, okay, I'll do that, and then you work along, and they'll say, was it done yet? And you're like, well, nope, not done yet. I'm working on this piece, and and they just dealt with that. At that point, you're dealing with their expectations, and you're just constantly telling them, well, this is where we are, and this is how much we have to do, but you really have no sense of how long it's going to take, and so the customers tend to be less satisfied in the waterfall method based on my experience. When I worked with the Agile and I said, well, this is where we are, this phase, and it's going to take us 2 more sprints to get to this point, all of a sudden the expectations I'm giving them are much more realistic for my development team. They actually can meet those expectations in reasonable way.
Maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but so you talked about the sitemap and having wireframes and a good picture for the developers so they can actually develop. When does that get done in Agile?
Agile?
Yeah.
All along. So so you go to work on this piece here. So whether you have a business analyst or someone that does the user interface design, wireframes and sitemaps, an IA person, they're going to work on that for the developers who are really involved in that process. but not necessarily for the whole thing, but just for that first piece, that first user story. I mean, they can be involved in the sprint as well, those individuals. It's not just developers that have user stories to work on. The user story might be, create the Visio design for the homepage. And those people get tasks in the beginning of the project. So while they're doing that, they get that done. You go into that second sprint where the developers actually have the requirements and they start coding. The UX person is now focused on this next piece here and working with the customer and getting the feedback. So it's a continuous process of doing that.
So your designers are always working like ahead of time?
Right.
So I'm working on an Agile project now at work. And the biggest issue we have is like, we're trying to design for the things that are being built in that sprint. So like, it'll take us days, maybe weeks to get our design, but meanwhile the developers are like sitting on their hands, like, all right, where's our screen? Where's the screen? Well, give me a second.
Right.
Get it done.
So it has to be staged appropriately. It's impossible for the developer to do anything until you're done.
Whose responsibility is it to like coordinate that?
I took that responsibility on as the architect and the team lead to sort of to do that, but and I guess I passed a lot of that responsibility on to my business analyst. Because that's who did our user stories, and that's who did a lot of our wireframing and the sitemap. I mean, I worked with her on those things because she doesn't have the IDEA background, she has the BA background, but kind of like worked with her to develop what we needed for these things.
That's how our operation is structured as well. The business analyst is like an arbitrator between the development players. So they're the ones that would say, for next sprint, I need this from your team so that these developers can execute in this sprint. Yeah.
And it's hoped that
But the effectiveness of that VA makes everything run right.
Yeah.
So
maybe that's what the issue I have, is that the people that should be doing that thing could up their game a little bit better.
That's a big role.
Question two, it seems like with the concept of velocity you're talking about, that's reasonable to try and calculate for developers who can churn out X lines of code in a day. But with design work, where you can go into a day thinking you're going to accomplish something, and then after running some user tests, have pretty much nothing to show because your hypothesis turned out to be completely invalid. How does that affect in this, where how much design work you can get accomplished can be really variable depending on how good your initial idea is compared to what your users tell you about it.
Right. And I think that's the same sort of idea with the when you're doing R&D work and you don't know what the end's going to look like, and you just have to be flexible. I've learned that Agile, and there's a book out there and you can go read it and it says do this and this and this and this and this, but every environment's different, and every group of people we can have the same environment and bring a couple new people in and the dynamic will change. When I think of Agile, I think about what are the great things I like about it, and what can we use from it and put it into the team. And we try things, and they might not work. You can't be afraid to be wrong. Sometimes you are, and you just kind of back that out and say, well, that's not working for us. Maybe if we did it this way. And so I'm not into the rigid, this is the way that you have to do it. When you run into those situations, and the idea of the sprint is that this is the amount of work, and when you get done, you throw a party, you celebrate, like, yeah, we did that. But sometimes the developer's like, well, I'm done. I don't have anything else to do. And Agile doesn't necessarily say pull things in, but that's what we do. And then there's other times where you're like, well, this isn't getting done, and you just push that out to the next sprint. You say, well, this isn't, like you said, this testing took place, and we're way off base. So what you would do is you create another work backlog item, another user story, put it on your backlog, and then before that next sprint occurs, you're meeting with your customer, or you're meeting with whoever's going to make the decisions about priority on this application, and that's another item. And they might say, well, you know what? I don't care that this is not the way that we need to have it that way. So I want you to go and do 5 more rounds of user testing. And so all of a sudden that becomes, 15 instead of 3 and when you're so the idea is that
when something happens, it changes what you're going to do, right? If you just, in the waterfall, you just plug along because you decided what you're going to do up front, and there isn't as much flexibility. In Agile, every time you're doing a sprint, you're reevaluating what it is that needs to be done. And the day one, when you started, by the time you get done, it might be completely different because the customer, ideally the customer is the one making the decision about the priorities of what you're working on. Because you're keeping, you're delivering to them, you're keeping them happy. So if you're doing something, it's not working, it doesn't get done, it's an item that goes on the product backlog, and 3-4 days before the end of the sprint, you're meeting with the customer saying, okay, these are our product backlog items, let's prioritize these. Prioritize them, take off your 15, that goes into the next sprint. It could be completely different what you thought it was going to be when you started that previous sprint. You might have had, you took those 15 and these 15 jumped up here. Those might not be the 15 that go into the next sprint, depending on where you are at that point in time. And that's the flexibility of Agile, is that you're able to shift gears and move in a different direction if that's what's required.
And how long do you take off between a 2-week sprint on average?
Well, you do your 2-week sprint, and then the next sprint starts Monday.
All right, so when you don't plan you don't have a day for planning the next sprint? It's just...
Yeah, you plan that sprint the Wednesday before, and then when do you guys do your planning?
We do 3-week sprints, and yeah, every 3 weeks there's a sprint planning session.
So the beginning of
like an hour and a half.
At the beginning of the 3rd week, your Scrum Master and maybe your program manager or BA might meet with the customer and talk about those things. And then a few days later, they'll meet with the developers to talk about the items that are going to be in the next sprint. And then the developers will start putting their tasks together for that next sprint. So when that next, they're still doing their sprint 3 work, hopefully they're wrapping it up, and you're starting to think about the next sprint. So when that next Monday comes, you're up ready to go.
So where does testing working with Agile? Because right now we're Waterfall, and I know everything that we produce before it goes to production, it could be in testing for like a month.
Mm-hmm. Those are user stories.
Yeah.
Those are, at that point, the developers might have less of a role in that. They might be off doing another project, while with a little bit of time dedicated to supporting the testing or making bug fixes.
But I mean, you're not going to testing after each sprint, right?
Yeah.
Oh, they are?
Yeah.
Okay.
The idea of it is that you're doing full life cycle within each sprint, or a couple of sprints. It might take 2 or 3 sprints to get to a release, but that you're getting to release quickly.
Gotcha.
And you go through the full process.
So there's been talks at my work that we're traditional Waterfall, but I don't even know what this would mean necessarily, but there's been talks about us going Agile-ish.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of doing the Agile process up until testing and then going to like Waterfall.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something, those hybrid processes?
Absolutely.
Done?
Absolutely. And I actually advocate that, because what's more disruptive for a team than like completely changing the way that you do things? It's all right. Nobody knows what they're
We
doing.
use a lot of offshore resources for certain things like testing and development. So,
Okay.
So I think that would probably be part of the struggle.
Yeah. You want to find what works for you, and you probably will find other people that would advocate Band-Aid approach. Rip it off and switch and go. Me, I find that disruptive for people to throw that at them. So I like to say, all right, we want to do Agile. what's the low hanging fruit? What can we start doing? All right, we're gonna have sprint meetings. All right, we're gonna have user stories defined for projects, loosely defined. We're gonna have much more thorough user stories. And each one of these is a stage as we moved into Agile until we got to the point, because developers, when you start talking about you're going to have to quantify how long it's going to take to do this task, and you're going to have to write this down beforehand. If you come and you drop all that on in one time, man, you're going to have people looking on monster.com like, I'm getting the hell out of here because I'm not doing all this crap. I just want to code.
Right.
And so I found, and I don't know, Julian, you can probably speak to this because I put you through it, that I tried to put things in place, see how they work, find out what worked for the developers, get their feedback, adjust what we were doing, to the point that they bought into that before we tried to do more.
Right.
And I don't know, it seemed to work pretty well.
Yeah, I think at first thing the developers like encounter is like resistance. You know, you feel the big brother, like you just want to track what we're doing, phase. But then, like Kevin said, he kind of backed off of it and like we eased into it more so. Like I feel a lot better in Agile than what we were doing before. Like I had a project where I worked a year into it before they completely changed the requirements. So like all that year, pretty much back to zero. Now, before we got into Agile, I was feeling pressure, like I needed to get it done because from the customer's point of view, they don't really care. They just changed the entire architecture. But now that I have the sprint to back me up, I'm not feeling as stressed and it's just getting done what I can get done. And they've kind of backed off on the expectations too. They see that this is being worked on. Now I can see what you worked on, and I can see it in front of us, and then move to the next phase. So.
And you've been able to deliver things in front of them that meet the expectation on that short-term 3-sprint period or whatever. You know, I've seen when he first worked on this project, and he was doing a lot of work, but never really got to a point of completion on anything because he was just doing so much on this, you know, trying to get it all done. But when we switched to the Agile and we talked about, you know, what are we going to do for this release and maybe these 3 sprints? All of a sudden, we do those 3 sprints, and then he's like, I'm going to have a customer meeting, and put something that was polished in front of them. And the work quality went up, everything improved in their perception of what they were getting. All of a sudden, they were starting to see results, and worked real well. So bite off what you can, make work what works. Don't force things, because you get resistance. Okay.
I have a question. Before, and not having worked with it, but just reading about it seemed like Agile would lend itself a little bit to scope creep, where, if you keep going back, oh no, that's not really what I really want. But then the way you described it, if you limit it or if you change it to just stories, there's no room for scope creep. Is that accurate?
In Agile, there's no such thing as scope creep.
But aren't you changing, if you say, this is what I want, and then it expands out, and now all of a sudden you're.
Absolutely.
But you never established that baseline, like you never established.
You're completing things every release cycle. And you're completing what the customer said is the most important thing for them. And if the customer wants to change that, you're in a position to have the dialogue about duration, about cost. I say there's no scope creep because the concept of scope creep isn't really something that you concern yourself with in Agile. You accept change in Agile. You embrace change in Agile. In Waterfall, scope creep destroys your baseline, your project timeline. But in Agile, you accept that as a likely outcome because you're working on what the customer says is the most important thing, and you get that done, and you put it in front of them, and you say, what do you want me to do next? And if it's completely different from what you thought, that's fine. It doesn't matter. That's what the customer needs and wants. And that you become much more customer focused in Agile, I think.
I just wanted to point out in my experience, and Joel's seen this as well, we work together, there is a concern, I think, with Agile, and it may come from this phenomenon of time estimates and time work that I was discussing, that there's too much descoping that takes place. If things are continually having to be pushed out of sprints and the backlog is piling up, or technical debt is starting to be taken on by always driving down to this MVP concept, this minimally viable product concept, it can work in the reverse, which is also not good, right? If you're putting out a product that just looks nice but can't scale or can't handle load or whatever, that's a problem. so it can actually go the other way.
Right.
But you gotta find a balance in the middle somewhere.
And I think that's where the project manager and the BA have to be responsible to the customer. When the customer's saying, well, no, I just want these things worked on, they have to be there, well, that's all well and good, but we have to concern ourselves with load. And the customer probably has no concept of what that means.
Right.
So you have, they have to be responsible for making sure this technical pieces the customer needs but doesn't know about are included.
Right, the VA also has to see things like, if this is a 100-question assessment tool that we're building, we probably need to develop a test harness to be able to efficiently test all the data validation in that, rather than having someone to physically sit and go through it after every release. Like, that's crazy. So you're actually, someone needs to know that and be able to make a story and make that part of the work.
Another thing you might encounter scope creep in Agile is when you really need to have like establish, okay, this is what we're doing in the sprint. Like if you're constantly still throughout the sprint, but not massaging the story, like, oh, I think it should be like this, and I think that's where you might introduce some scope creep. But if you say, okay, we want the story to be this, and then you build it, and then afterwards the project owner is like, oh, actually, it should be this. That's the kind of flexibility. But with that discussion saying, okay, it needs to be this, you already had that conversation with the business owner saying, this is what I want.
I guess I'm thinking like in DoD, getting more money for anything is it's not an easy process. And so if you say, okay, no, this is what I want, you paid for that. Oh, no, really what I want is this. Getting funding for that isn't always a practical consideration.
I think that's the wild card with both methodologies, is how is the commitment being made? And do those that we need to implement have any voice in that process of the timeline, of the scope, from the very beginning? What is it that we're building? I think it's very often a commitment is made to market, and then everybody just has to figure out how to get there. And there probably should be a little bit more in that process.
And that's absolutely true. And when I think about Waterfall and Agile and the two, when you run into a situation that unreasonable demand, Waterfall, you're never going to get to the end. You just, if it's unreasonable and you're trying to get it all done, you're probably about halfway through the Waterfall process when you run out of time and money. In Agile, you're continually adapting to what the schedule and the customer's needs are, and you get something done. I mean, if it's unreasonable, what can you do to meet it? You've got more points than you've got velocity. They're not going to come together. Over time, the Agile process will instruct you to tell the customer, look, that's not going to happen time and budget. Your budgets, your estimates are going to become much more accurate because you've got these user stories, you've got an idea of how long it takes to do, you got a velocity of the team. It breaks it down and makes it easier to work with.
I wrote a thing on F-35X, and it seems like I'm trying to place Agile within that construct of it. This thing started off costing this many billions, and now it's actually $1 trillion. And part of it is because every consideration that they didn't think of in the beginning has now, as the process has gone along, been cleared up, and scope creep, cost creep, everything. And it seems to me that you started at the beginning, said it's going to do this, I'm going to give you this much money, and that's, even if it was more defined, it wouldn't cost more. I don't know that that's a fair assessment.
I think it's fair, but I don't know that Waterfall or Agile are the variables that are going to help that. In my mind, this kind of process where you spend some time thinking about what you're going to build, and as he was talking about, building in the testing harness and having someone on the team that understands what full development lifecycle is all about. It's not just about I come up with an idea, I code it, I test it, it goes out. There's a ton of things that are involved in putting out a product, especially one of that scope. And I feel like the Agile process gives you the ability to be successful along the way, more so than the waterfall method. And at the point that you've hit your $5 million budget, you'll have something. And it might not be complete, but it might be complete enough that you can say, well, we're gonna go with this, and then we'll procure some more money to do this next phase of development. Agile gives you the ability to have success in phases, I think, more so than a waterfall where if you don't get done, if you don't get to the end, then you don't have anything. And so the success of software projects in Agile, you get success immediately. That you do 3 sprints and you release, you've succeeded. And so it gives you that opportunity for success. And the experience I've had with customers is that they're pretty happy. They don't have everything they need, but they see something that is polished early on in the process. And they can be satisfied with that.
So there's a couple of questions from a different form than the one I was monitoring. Firstly, who's Kevin? Because Catherine says hi, Catherine Summers. Oh, this Kevin.
I'm
This
Kevin.
Kevin. Okay. I'm sorry. Catherine Summers says hi. I thought she'd see someone walk through. She was asking also about if UX designers are 1 sprint ahead of the developers. I'll read it to you. It sounds like UX designers are 1 sprint ahead of developers, which makes sense. Does testing happen 1 sprint behind the developers or simultaneously?
Well, when you're thinking about release, then yes, that would make sense that the UX designers are working on the next piece that the developer is going to work on, and then the testers are working on the piece the developers just finished up. Now that could all happen within the same sprint depending on the scope of the work. But I think you would find that the UX needs to be finished up before the developers can engage in what they need to build. And that the testers, of course, they're not going to be able to do anything until the developers have finished up theirs. So it is a staged process, and you're looking to get to that release. So it might be a 3-week sprint where the developers don't have a whole lot going on in that first sprint. Maybe they're setting up their environment, they're getting ready. But the UX, they're engaged in a lot of things that first sprint. The second sprint, the developers are doing their thing, and then the third sprint, the testers are doing their thing, and the developers are doing bug fixes. Is that how you guys are you guys engaging in that?
Our QA and UX testing is very scrambled and under-resourced, and the last thought, it's getting developed.
Oh yeah, we have to do that too, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, for my team, our last release was finishing of 6 sprints. We basically designed up through sprint 5 or 4.5, and then during that last sprint, we did our testing, and with the hopes of being able to get whatever minor changes in before we go live. And if anything major came out, we would just get it in the next release. That's really just kind of how the development team puts priority on usability testing. Ideally, we do it more often and more regularly.
I think we've covered all the questions.
Okay. So what time are we getting to, Andrew?
It's 11:15 right now, so I think maybe 5-10 minutes. And then...
Let's say my car's expires at 11:32. So.
Okay. I think it's been great so far. I mean, if there any other questions from the group.
There's another question from her relating to if through testing later on you find a new requirement, does that just go in as a new user story and you get to it on whatever sprint you can?
So that gets dropped on the project backlog, a new user story, prioritized by the customer and the Scrum Master and the BA. And then, based on its priority, it goes into sprint appropriate form.
If your researchers defined a requirement that they think is much more important than the customer seems to think it is, how do you resolve that?
Through interaction with the customer. Agile, the customer is the focus.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't make a case and convince them, where are you? Who pays the bills? It's interpersonal skills.
Do you find that problematic when like the research with the users will identify things the users say they want, but your actual client doesn't really want to listen to what the intended user? Like you experience that where that disconnect happens?
Not in our environment, not what I've experienced as much, because we don't have a big UX experience going on with the projects. But I can acknowledge that certainly could happen, and that's where your BA and your project manager are really, if they're worth their salt, they're the ones that are talking to the customer and making them realize the value of that input from the tester. What are you going to do? If the customer pays the bill, you are the technical expert. Most cases, the customers I deal with, and maybe I'm lucky, they see me as the expert, and they defer to me on things that they don't know much about. And you being in the IDIA program and getting your master's in this area, that's going to be a really nice card to pull out on people, when you need it. Say, well, we've done user testing and we've determined this, and and you show them things. Sometimes you got to build a good case. You can't just say, well, we want to do this because users said that. You've got to be able to demonstrate to them. And my experience is that most customers are willing to listen, and they really want a great product as well. And if you can show them something that says, well, if you do this, your customers are going to be happier. They're willing to listen.
Two more questions from the online. First, Vipul is asking, can you give us one example of a user story, please?
Okay. So a user story, there's a formula for it. This user needs to do this in order to accomplish this goal, or in order to recognize this value. So I'll use this as this example with this system. So the HR forms administrator needs to be able to create questions for the evaluation so that respondents will be able to perform an evaluation. So it's a user needs to be able to do something in order to obtain some value. So that's sort of the formula for your user stories. And there's some really good online resources. If user stories and creating user stories, as I say, use the knowledge base, also known as Google. There's a lot of really good formulas about how to do that and what's required in that. The important thing about the user story is you don't want it to be so big and grandiose and generic that the developer can't break it down into tasks and get it done in a reasonable amount of time. If it's big, you probably need to break it down a little bit.
That was my question, like how specific does it get?
So you need to think about it in terms of like that level of effort. If you're estimating it's going to be 6, which could be more than a week on a user story, you want to start thinking about breaking that down. You don't want something that's that big. You want it to be much more discreet.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say 2 things. One, I think it's Atlassian is a software company that has tools called Jira, Confluence, Bitbucket that are very prevalent, used in this type of methodology for development. So that's just one thing to familiarize yourself with if you can. And then 2, Yes, I think it all goes back to this position of Scrum Master or Product Manager or Business Analyst. That person has to have a very unique skill set. If they need to know something about development, they need to be an effective project manager, and if it's an internal software development effort, meaning you're not a software development shop just building for clients, but you're building for yourself as the client, they have to have intimate knowledge of the business practices in that place. If they don't have all of those three, you're in trouble. So just watch out for that.
Welcome to my world.
And one more question from Catherine. Do the usability folks just get to write a new user story, or do they have to persuade the business analyst before it gets into the backlog?
So in our shop, the business analysts wrote the user stories for us. I think if you had a user experience component to your development shop, that the two of them would work very closely. The business analyst would work with the customer and kind of come up with the ideas of what needs to happen. And if they're not working with the UX person to sort of translate that, it's gonna suffer. I guess I saw myself in my role as the UX person, and I instructed the BA about what needed to be done and what had to be done. But you could have a BA who is really versed in that kind of stuff, who could take a much larger role. So I guess the answer is it depends on the expertise of the people that you're working with. If you're lucky, you have a BA person who is, like I was, who just embraced all this stuff and was like wanted to learn it all and wanted to do the user experience stuff and draw the wireframes and detail the items. And then because she was writing the user stories based on the wireframes, we did this before we wrote the user stories out for the sprints. We kind of defined how it was going to work, and then we wrote the user stories to match. All right, I do need to wrap up.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. kscott4@comcast.net. If anybody has any questions or needs anything, I think I've provided the on the
Yeah,
bio as
I'll
well.
make it out here. Share it out there, right?
Yeah, feel free to reach out to me.
Thanks, Kevin.